published in a science journal some findings, and they were the first ones who suggested that we humans are doing a geophysical experiment. In other words, we are doing an experiment with the planet Earth. In other words, we are messing with the planet. What is geophysical experiment? To understand what they meant is, there is a little bit of a very short lesson in earth sciences that is necessary in geology. About 300 million years ago, there is an era in the history of planet Earth. It's called Carboniferous era. That's an era where Earth has undergone many epochs in history of 4.5 billion years. During that time, about 20 million years, the vegetation that was dying, swamps were being formed, and it was getting buried deeper and deeper into Earth. And the animals, species that were dying, or for millions and millions of years, getting deeper and deeper into the Earth crust. And what happens over millions of years, that vegetation, the wood and the leaves, they become coal under tremendous pressure of Earth crust. And the animals, their bones and their, primarily bones, eventually become oil. So these scientists were saying that what we are doing is, now this carbon, what is carbon? The human body, animal's body, is all carbon. What is trees? It's all carbon. Carbon is the very foundation of life. We are made of carbon, primarily carbon, attached with hydrogen and oxygen. That's what makes a human being. 70% of it is water. And water is what? Hydrogen and oxygen. So they said that this was buried deep into Earth, the carbon source, which is, from the viewpoint of chemistry, is the source of carbon dioxide. Now we humans, since the industrialization of the West, the last couple of 100 years, we started digging that carbon out, that carbon dioxide that was buried deep. Now we started digging it out and start releasing it back into the atmosphere. It was sucked from the atmosphere in the first place, from the environment, and then we are putting it back into the atmosphere. That's what they meant when they said geophysical experiment. They said we are doing an experiment with the whole Earth, not realizing that we are doing it. But they didn't pass any judgment. They didn't say anything. They said, it seems like we are doing a geophysical experiment. Perhaps we should start recording some data and find out, since the advent of industrialization in the West, what's been happening to carbon dioxide levels by burning fossil fuels and the engines and the railway that we discovered, and it revolutionized the West. What has it done to the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere? Let's start recording and keeping some data and track it and see what we find. Dr. Charles David Keeling, another scientist about the same time, he started studying that. He was studying to see how much carbon dioxide is actually being released in the atmosphere, how much of it is being absorbed by the ocean, how much of it gets absorbed by the plants, because that's what plants do. They eat carbon dioxide and they let out oxygen, which we breathe, and then we let out carbon dioxide for the plants, and they eat our waste product and give us back the oxygen. So they play a major role in the carbon dioxide oxygen content in the atmosphere. This has been, you will very often hear, this is also one of the common challenges, that carbon dioxide, the ocean will absorb it, and then you will hear a talk show host saying, it's good for the planet because we have better crops because there's more carbon dioxide. You will hear all these arguments that get mentioned in the course of this. But I'm going back in history to tell you that these issues have been resolved a very long time ago. They have been studied and settled by a method called the scientific method. These are the questions, not these people are asking. These questions were asked by scientists long time ago, and they were looked into. And they were looked into to see, are we being fooled? We need to make sure is the ocean good enough to absorb all the carbon dioxide? Then we don't have to worry about it. So they studied this phenomenon. In 1960, Dr. Keeling also said that by 2000, there will be 25% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In 1964, by that time, there were a lot of predictions that, if we inadvertently, not realizing that we are doing it, we increase the temperature in the atmosphere, eventually it's going to melt the icebergs and we're going to have flooding problems. Especially coastal areas are going to go underwater because ice melts, the level of the sea goes up gradually. These were just predictions. But the US military, and US military is always the first one to become interested in any new science, and for a good reason. Whenever a new technology, a scientist come up with a new finding, who jumps on it? The first person jumps on it is US military, because they want to exploit it for military purposes. Recently, in the last 5-7 years, someone came up with the idea of invisible technology that you can actually, and we are almost there. You're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years that you can have soldiers walking around, but you can't see me. How are you going to fight me? So if we perfect that technology, you can't see me. They already have invisible cloaks. You can't see me, but you can maybe see my eyes, but we're going to find a way to fool you with that too. So you can't even see my eyes. You can't see anything. So who is jump on it first? Military. Military always does that, primarily for military reasons and secondarily sometimes for agricultural reasons, but the primary goal is always military. So during that time, military was already right away starting to do experiments to see if we can change the weather patterns with our technology. So the countries that we want to kill or fight, we take away the water vapor from above them. So they have desert, they have no rain, no water. Why go shoot them? They will just die if we change the weather pattern. And it was clear that there certain technologies can possibly be developed. Actually, nobody has access to the US military government documents. There is a notion that actually they did develop very low frequency waves. If you let very, very low frequency, which means very lengthy wavelengths of radiation in the upper atmosphere, it will change the winds in the lower atmosphere, and you can change the planet in areas where there is usually a lot of rain, they will become deserts, and where there are deserts, you can make rain pour so much that you can flood the place. So that technology actually does exist. I think Russia has some of that technology. But why did the US military stop developing that? Because some of these scientists were warning that, you mess with the weather, there is a risk that it may go out of hand and it can, without us realizing, come back and boomerang on us. This is not well understood. And this was in relation to when they were studying what humans are doing. We are changing the climate by changing temperatures and pressures and radiation. We still don't understand how that works, so let's not develop this kind of technology. Although it's still on the US military's list, once we perfect the technology, they will probably get back to this and try to develop that. This is a technology of the future. 1964, I was at 1964. There was another scientist who was head of the National Academy of Sciences, Gordon MacDonald. He published some papers, and he said the same thing, that we might, without realizing, modify the weather. In 1970, there were many reports and warnings came from scientific organizations that weather is changing and we are doing it due to burning fossil fuels, and we are not realizing that that's happening. The first committee, science committee in this regard that stands out is Jason Committee. What is Jason Committee? Jason Committee is a committee of very distinguished elite scientists, the top scientists in the country that government picked, and they advise the government on what's going on different issues. And this is the first committee who used the word actually that global warming is happening and is anthropogenic. In other words, we are doing it by burning fossil fuels. And government, for the right reasons, they want to get a second opinion, like this is a serious issue, you can't fool with it. So they asked the National Academy of Sciences to study all science about it, study all literature, and come up with some kind of consensus, give their opinion to the government. And that is what came to be known later as Charney Report. You might remember the word Charney Report, 30 years ago. This was, Charney Report was a report that was submitted to the government by the National Academy of Sciences, and they suggested that carbon dioxide is actually going up, and they also predicted that if it doubles, they predicted that it might double in amount in the atmosphere by the year 2035. This was predicted in 1979 by Charney Report, submitted to the government by National Academy of Sciences. And what was that report? The important thing about that report was it's not a group of scientists' opinion or one scientist's opinion. Remember, this committee was established by the government after the Jason Committee's report, because now the government wants to look into it much further. So it was not a report, it was a meta-analysis. So that you know what meta-analysis is. Meta-analysis in science refers to searching literature, seeking opinions from all experts, looking at history, what has been discovered, what has been established, what is the scientific reports that have met all the challenges in the past and have proven to be correct over and over again. So it is a meta-analysis of all the science that has been done on the subject to that point. And actually 40 different scientists signed on it, experts. And it was at that time that government started to think about some kind of national energy policy. Actually, a national energy policy was adopted in 1988 by the government to minimize emissions. I came here in early 1980s. I've been here for 30 years. So prior to that, it's all based on what I have studied. After that, I remember some of these things, but prior to 1980, I wasn't here. Besides, I was a very young adult. I'm not even sure I would be so interested in those things at that time. So I want to emphasize, there's a little bit more history, but one thing I want to emphasize again about the scientific method. The reason I'm giving you this history, that this year this happened, this year who said what, this year that person was challenged, then they looked into it again, then another committee was established, then a second committee was established to look into their work, if it's true or not. This is called scientific method. It doesn't like show up one morning and someone says there's global warming and you believe it. So it took scientists nearly several decades before they start to say, you know what, this is really true. Because all the challenges that we had, we have looked into that. And they were all legitimate challenges. For example, Gilbert Plas was a scientist in 1950. There was a big challenge at that time. The kind of challenges that you hear on TV all the time now, the biggest challenge at that time, and they continue to challenge that, critics today. Do you believe 60 years later, after the issue has been established, people still come on TV and say, how do you know if it's water vapor or carbon dioxide? It was settled 60 years ago. Gilbert looked at, he was a specialist in spectroscopy, where what they do is they look at the absorption bands of water vapor versus carbon dioxide, all these molecules, and he established that they do not overlap. You can clearly tell. So we know for the last 60 years that from absorption spectroscopy, you can actually tell if there are overlaps between two different kind of molecules or not. But we continue to say that in the media. Why do we say that? Because 99% of the public has no clue, and they will believe you. And there are many, many challenges like that that have been put forward.